You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 377 of the podcast. And in this one, I got back on Mike Heady. Mike is co-owner and co-director of the Anxiety and Stress Disorders Institute of Maryland, where he has specialized in the treatment of OCD, anxiety disorders, and related conditions for the last 16 years. And I got Mike on to talk about inference-based cognitive behavioural therapy. I've had some of you asking for me to cover this topic, so I wanted to cover it again. I did cover it back in 2016, where I got on Dr. Kieran O'Connor, who has sadly passed away since that time. And back then, it was called Inference-based therapy, I-CBT. And not too long ago, it's gone through a name change to I-CBT, which is Inference-based cognitive behavioural therapy. So we talk about why the name change, or why we think the name changed. Mike shares what is I-CBT, what I-CBT therapy looks like for OCD, inferential confusion, doubt, the concept of reality sensing, can I-CBT be integrated with ERP and ACT, vulnerable self themes, and much more. I really enjoyed this chat with Mike. It's definitely a different way to view OCD and the treatment of it. So hopefully you guys get something from this. And if it resonates with you, then I will probably cover this therapy more in the future. And Mike has kindly created a PDF with some common questions around I-CBT. So if you're interested in finding out more, I'll put a link in the show notes to that PDF where you can download it and read his answers. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. This podcast episode is available as a video recording on our Patreon. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to you guys, as always, for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, thank you to Mike for his time and coming on and sharing his expertise on I-CBT. And without further ado, here he is. Welcome back to the show, Mike.
Hi, thanks for having me back, Stu.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. And, it's been a while since we last spoke. It might have even been on OCD and dating. Was that our last one?
Yeah, OCD and dating. Yeah, that was my very first podcast ever.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Haven't we done two, or am I making that up?
Nope, you made that up. I wished we'd have done two before that, but no, yeah, it's just the one.
Okay.
So
it was so good. It replicated twice in my mind.
Yeah, there you go. I like that.
Cool. Well, this is our second. So, what's been up with you since we last spoke?
Wow, a lot. Since we last spoke, when we last spoke, I was the associate director of the Anxiety and Stress Disorders Institute. Now I am the co-director of it. So Sally Winston is still the executive director. And then me and Dr. Sarah Crawley are co-director and co-owners of the Institute. So that's a big change that happened in April of 2020, right as the pandemic was in full swing. Other than that, I've been doing a lot of trainings and talks and sort of challenging my own social anxiety avoidance in the world of OCD and anxiety disorders. And I've learned a lot about a new treatment that we're going to talk about today. I mean, new to us, new historically, I guess, compared to others. I-CBT, and I've spent the last couple of years sort of really immersing myself and learning that. So that's what's new with me.
Brilliant. Well, congrats on the promotion, if we call it that. Becoming a part owner, and that's awesome. So let's talk about I-CBT, inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy. Very broad question. What is it?
It's a good question. That's a good place to start. So it is a specialized cognitive behavioral therapy that's developed specifically for OCD. And the emphasis is like bold letters cognitive, right? So it is a cognitive therapy almost entirely. And so the I that comes before the CBT is really the sole focus of this model. And I said before, it's new historically, it's new to us, but it's been around since the mid 90s. I think one of the first conceptual papers published was in 95. So it's not like new. It's just kind of new to, at least new to us in the States, maybe new to other places around the world too.
Yeah. And of course, it came out of Canada, right?
Yes, it came out of Montreal. Doctors Kieran O'Connor, the late Kieran O'Connor, and Fred Ardema are the primary developers of the model. And then other researchers and labs across Canada and in Europe have been sort of picking up what they started with. So
brilliant. And Kieran, of course, was British, so it's at least a 50% British therapy.
That's right. Yes, take credit where you can, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting. And as speaking of Kieran, as I said off the air, I had him on back in 2016 when it was called inference-based therapy, so I-CBT, and I can't find it anywhere. And I've been really curious, and I could guess why the name was changed, but if you have any understanding why and when that change was made.
Well, I certainly don't want to speak for Fred as to why the name changed, but sort of there's been some iterations. Inference-based approach, which is sort of the conceptual theoretical model that underlies inference-based therapy, which is the practical application of the conceptual model of OCD. And they changed it to inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy. Then my guess is because it is a cognitive behavioral therapy, is something people already understand. And so it seats itself in that camp because that's what it's doing, but it's focusing on a specialized kind of cognitive work, which is sort of dysfunctional reasoning processes or dysfunctional reasoning narratives that are unique and specific to OCD. And that's why they put the word inference in front of it. I think it's really to clarify what it is they're going after.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and my guess was, like, from a marketing perspective, if as soon as you call it CBT, you'll get all the CBT therapists like, oh, they're one of us, I might as well retrain in it. Versus inference-based therapy, what the hell is that? I'm leaving that alone.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a good opportunity to sort of let the CBT therapists know we're not sort of antithetical to what you're doing, but we're unique and different enough that it's something that you have to learn. But we're not proposing new we're not proposing something completely wacky or out of the blue, right? We're proposing things that are well within the wheelhouse of cognitive theory and cognitive understanding of things.
Yeah, which of course what CBT is really about, because behaviorists might look at cognitive approaches badly, and more cognitive therapists might look at behaviorists and like, what the hell are you doing? But yet they're both under the same umbrella and have to accept one another. So
that was the grand bargain, several decades ago, when they were kind of at each other's throats a bit, going, no, it's all behavioral, and it's like, no, it's cognitive. And the argument is that both processes impact one another. And so we have to sort of find a way to coexist, because we don't have precise mechanisms of change ironed out as facts. We know that habituation occurs. We don't exactly know how and why. We know that inhibitory learning is a thing that's relevant. The how and the why are still being looked at. When if we're talking I-CBT, we know that inferential confusion is a real thing. And could it be that they all somehow are connected? Perhaps. Currently, the research is still in these two different camps, right?
Yeah, really good point. And last thing I'll say on the acronym, and then I'll drop it, is I-CBT in the UK already existed as internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy, which is basically CBT through a computer. As far as I'm aware, I could be butchering that. But it was a term created within the UK I think in the UK. Anyway, so when you Google it, that comes up first. So, Fred's got his work cut out to bump up the SEO ranking on that one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's this alphabet soup in our field, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, and then there's CBTI for CBT for insomnia, and it's like, I mean, how many acronyms can we throw at people at one time? So
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good point. And of course, going ACT also means a test, right? ACT is a test in America, I think.
Yeah, it's sort of an equivalent of the SATs.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So actually, where I want to go now, again, keep it broad, and I have got more specific questions as we go on, but I think initially to get the listeners, they know what ERP looks like. They most likely know what ACT looks like. In a very broad sense, what does treatment through an I-CBT lens look like?
So in a broad sense, the treatment of someone with OCD with I-CBT would begin with psychoeducation like any other model. We would help the client understand that there is a workable and understandable sequence to their suffering. And we would map it out. And the sequence, it's a 5-part sequence that we tend to talk about. It starts with a prompt. And I can give you like an example of an actual OCD case that we can walk through it real broadly. Yeah. Let's take a hit and run OCD because it's kind of a harm OCD. It's somewhat stereotypically understood. Someone's driving down the road, everything is fine. They're sipping their coffee, heading to work, and then they run over a pothole. And that right there is the point at which they experience a change in what's happening. Now, the pothole isn't the problem, right? Potholes don't cause OCD, right?
Just punctured tires.
Right, and bent rims, right?
Yeah.
So the person hits the pothole, we call that the prompt, right? There's nothing pathological or problematic about it. 100 people hit the pothole. They all had a very different conclusion. Like, what if my tire blows out? What if I bend my rim? But the person with harm OCD or hit and run OCD hits the pothole, and then they think to themselves, what if that was a person? And that's the second part of the sequence. So it goes prompt, and then it goes into the doubt. And the doubt is a verb, right? It's a reasoning process. Sometimes we refer to it as the inference of doubt or the conclusion to doubt. And this doubt is, what if I hit a person? So in the ERP model, some people might call that the intrusion, right? It's an intrusive thought that sort of slammed into my consciousness. The I-CBT folks say, I don't think it was intrusive, really. I think it was an inference process. It was a conclusion to doubt something or to doubt information about what just happened. You didn't conclude that you could have blown out your tire. You concluded that you could have hit a person. So this is where the problem begins. Part 2 with that what if, right? It's a very specific kind of what if. Now, moves on to the next part that we call the consequence. If I just hit someone with my car, then they could be dying on the side of the road. This is what starts to really absorb people into this frightening narrative. If someone's dying on the side of the road, I feel full of panic and guilt and anxiety, which then creates an urgency to reconcile that experience. I need to know. I need to fix. So they do a compulsion, right? They check their mirrors, they turn the car around, they get out and they start searching the sides of the road for a person. So this is the sequence. It's the 5-part sequence: prompt, doubt, consequence of that doubt, emotion, and then compulsion. And we just map this out to demystify it. This is a workable thing. And treatment, after we establish this, really starts to zero in, not on the consequences. What if there's a body on the side of the road? Not on the emotions, anxiety, guilt, panic, and not even really on the compulsions. It focuses on what preceded all of that. what kickstarted all of it? What was the first domino to fall? And it wasn't the pothole. It was that specific doubt. That's where everything went haywire. And then we want to understand how that doubt came about. We want to explain that it really wasn't an intrusion, or it wasn't a thought that came bombarding into your consciousness willy-nilly, randomly, that it was actually something that you were somewhat vulnerable to already. And we can talk about that in a few minutes. So that's where everything begins, is with this doubt. Now, it turns out it's either a normal doubt, most people would have concluded the same thing, or it was an obsessional doubt. You concluded this, but most people wouldn't have. And so we go into understanding, what are your reasons for buying into this doubt? We really want to understand what absorbed you, what tricked you. And then we explain how all of this is wrapped up in a clever, well-constructed, well-defended narrative, right? Because we call it a dysfunctional reasoning narrative. It's not just a bullet point of catastrophic thinking and minimization. It wraps up in a narrative like a scary dream. And it adds a sense of credibility to the process. So treatment is all about reducing those things, those processes that created the obsessional doubt, as we call it, and maintained it. And so, I can go into the different modules, but that's the broad piece of treatment. And so the focus is on helping you understand the things I mentioned, right? That there's a sequence. It starts with a doubt. There's reasons behind that doubt. It's packaged up in a story. It's highly selective and personal to you. And that's because of what we call vulnerable self-themes, which deserves its own little paragraph of conversation. And as we start moving through the model, we help people distinguish what are the normal doubts that everyone has, and how did you reason yourself into that normal doubt versus obsessional doubts, and how the reasoning is quite different despite appearing similar. And then we help break all of that down so that the person eventually dismisses that process, right? To put it broadly, they use the reasoning that they use everywhere else in their life, which is normal and good and functional. And they use it in these moments that were previously obsessionally reasoned with. Yeah. So the client isn't learning how to reason. They're learning to use the good reasoning they have already in those obsessional moments where they previously weren't. That's the fundamental goal, to trust your senses again, to trust yourself again, because obsessional doubting makes you distrust those things. Is that broad enough?
Yeah, it's a really, really good answer. And I guess maybe a devil's advocate question that comes to my mind is, and this isn't just for I-CBT, it's for any cognitive-based therapy, is if we're going into the cognition, or even like cognitive restructuring, for example, like looking for evidence for or against and then an alternative. Yeah. And this approach, is it not going to encourage rumination, that we're looking at the content almost?
I think what the data has shown us is that there's a tendency to if you challenge content, say like Beckian kind of cognitive therapy, where you're like, how much do you believe this now that we've talked about the evidence, that could increase or get utilized as a kind of compulsive reassurance. I don't think that that's 100% the case all of the time, but it's enough of the case, enough of the time that we don't really want to do it. And what I-CBT is doing something completely different. There isn't a challenging about whether there's Ebola on your hands or not. What there's no form anywhere in the I-CBT manual that suggests we challenge your believability in that thought by some percentage decrease. There's none of that. What we're doing is we're going after a process. Does this process actually make sense when we help you see it clearly, and when we compare it to how you normally reason? So we're comparing it to sort of a process orientation rather than fighting individual thoughts at the level of content, because that is going to get real sticky real fast.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's interesting. So I just got a million like thoughts in my head and I'm not, not sure where to go with them. So, something I wanted to ask about, um, yeah, okay. So you kind of alluded to it. So any other examples you want to give of using I-CBT to work through obsessional doubts? Because as you say, that's what I-CBT is targeting, right? Is that initial doubt?
Right. Well, I mean, I don't have an example off of the top of my head, but I do think it's worth reiterating here that there is, if we want to conceptualize OCD as the obsession is the thing that kickstarts everything, and I think most people would agree on that, right? That it's not the compulsion that makes the obsession; it's the obsession that seems to kickstart all of the rest of the experiences. That this model looks at the obsessional formation as a workable, changeable thing, right? So historically, the other models have said, well, obsessions come from either normal intrusions, right? Like that we all get normal intrusions. But the difference, the difference between people who don't have OCD and people who do is that they appraise those intrusions as somehow more meaningful or problematic or intolerable. And that sort of wrestling match is what creates the obsessional process. So from that model, there is no treatment of the intrusion. The intrusion is normal, right? It's the evaluation and then the downstream processes like compulsions and avoidance that the most traditional models go after. And I-CBT is saying it's not an intrusion. It's not this sort of thing that's normal that happens to everyone, that for people with OCD, it's a very distinct dysfunctional reasoning narrative that is showing up, and that it is applied selectively to things that you're vulnerable to. So whatever example of OCD, whether it's POCD, sexual orientation OCD, we're going to find that when we apply this sequence to it, that there is a moment where there is a doubt, and assuming we're right with our diagnosis, that doubt shouldn't be. Right. It's not the kind of doubt that should have been arrived at, because there isn't anything in the here and now to conclude that doubt. And we can go into that with some examples. But so, yes, we are highlighting the obsessional doubt process, the mechanisms, the reasoning devices, the whole construction of an obsession is what I-CBT is focusing on, so that we can dismantle those processes and not use them anymore.
Okay, thank you. And then something that I'm interested in within I-CBT that when I was reading through it and trying to get my head around it again, like I said, I know I covered it in 2016, but I don't think I really grasped it then, is reality sensing. So yeah, just what you want to, what is it and
sure.
Why use it?
So one of the 12 modules, 12 processes that we use in I-CBT is called reality sensing. It is at the tail end of treatment, meaning it's one of the last things we're doing, right? So we have several modules we go through before that. There's a lot of learning, there's a lot of understanding, there's a lot of insight that occurs weeks and weeks and weeks before we get to reality sensing. Reality sensing is, if I'm being a little bit too simplistic, it is the normal use of your senses in circumstances that you used to not trust them or use them normally. So how I use my senses to cross the street is just, I listen, I see, I don't see or hear cars coming. I make the decision that it's safe to cross the street. But with someone who has OCD and distrusts their senses when it comes to, say, safety, they might stare and stare because they're not trusting what they see. They might listen extra hard. That's not normal use of the senses. That's obsessional use of the senses. It's a distrust of the senses. So reality sensing is you've done all of this learning. We've done all of this insight into how your obsession was constructed. We now know that the obsession wasn't brought about through normal or reality centered means, that it was primarily a construction of the imagined or the hypothetical state of affairs. And so now we want you, with all of this new knowledge and understanding, to go and use your senses and functions, quote unquote, normally, as you do in every other area of your life where OCD doesn't show up, but you do it here. So the same way I know chicken is cooked through, I use my senses. The same way I know milk is bad, I use my senses, right? And the same way I know how to merge onto traffic and not have a car accident, I use my senses. And I use them normally and just fine. I use my senses normally and fine in these areas where previously I hadn't, right? That's reality sensing. The description here is that it's not intended to be this effortful, distressing experience, right? This is not some chopped down version of ERP, right? The vast majority of clients I've worked with, and I think this is true for other clinicians, is that by the time they've gotten to reality sensing, it just makes sense to do this. Okay. Right. So of course, this doubt doesn't make sense. I don't need to buy into it. So I'm going to work on using my senses normally, because I may have spent a decade not using them normally in this area. That's the broad picture of reality sensing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that was going to be my question. It's kind of like when you tell someone, all right, we don't need to do the compulsion here. We need to leave it alone, walk away. That is a struggle. That's a battle for most people, and it's really tough. But here you've said by this point, it makes sense. They've done so much work that they are able to not be as distressed and to leave it alone.
Right. And I think the question conceptually for our field is the struggle required? You know, like when we front load treatment, and again, even ERP doesn't start off day one with challenging your hierarchy, right? There is psychoed, there is learning, there is buy-in, there is relationship building. Yeah. So it could be 3, 4, 5 sessions before you start going after a hierarchy in even traditional ERP. But, you know, we're not following a habituation model in I-CBT. We're following a cognitive model, an inference model. And so we're not requiring people to be distressed in the least. There's no added value from this model to do this with extra effort or extra distress. If it happens to be that you must be distressed or that you happen to be distressed, that's fine. And if you don't want to do it, we want to back you up to an earlier module and see where we're stuck. But it isn't required to be effortful or distressed the way it might be presented from other models, where it's like you need to activate your amygdala, you need to get anxious, you need to learn through a process of habituation or safety learning, which would be the inhibitory learning model. That's not the model that's driving this treatment.
Yeah, targeting something different. So another question that comes to my mind in this moment is around ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. I believe you use that or used to use it. Yeah. So when I think about working with clients and we're resisting compulsions, or even intrusive thought comes up, we then use those ACT skills of diffusion, self as context, present moment awareness, focusing on your values, you know, noticing and naming. Oh, look, my brain's telling me that I want to kill someone. You know, that again, diffusion. But they're different approaches, I-CBT and ACT, but it feels like they're doing the same thing, but with different theoretical frameworks behind them. They're having the same.
I had the exact same questions about ACT. I was probably less generous than you were when I first learned this. I'm like, isn't this just ACT? Like, how is this not just like, and it really isn't. I think that the devil's in the details here. So first of all, as you already know, but the listeners may or may not, ACT is a transdiagnostic model, right? So it's not built for any one particular disorder. It's built on sort of the understanding of human suffering, broadly defined, right? And that they come up with these core principles that perpetuate or manufacture human suffering. And they create a way of responding differently, relating to differently, living differently to reduce that kind of a suffering. And I'm probably building a bit of a straw man of ACT, and that's not my intention, but that's the general practice. If we think about how ACT has been applied to OCD, because that's the real comparison here, that the way ACT conceptualizes OCD is identical to the way CBT ERP has been conceptualizing OCD for many, many, many decades, which again comes back to my earlier comment about how they see OCD as beginning with an intrusive thought that's normal, and that the problem begins with your relationship to that thought that now we need to diffuse from, that now we need to relate to differently to, have a new relationship with. And so ACT is about doing that, which also involves a heavy dose of exposure, right? Behavioral challenges. We're not going to do compulsions. We're going to live life through your values, which involves doing exposures. But they leave alone the process by which they think is not pathological, that intrusive thought process. So basically, it's like what they're saying is intrusive and normal. I-CBT is saying, no, the problem here is that it's not an intrusion. It's a faulty inference. We can do something about that, that we don't have to let it alone. We don't have to just turn our back on it and accept that I'm going to have these intrusive thoughts forever. No, that there's a difference in this I-CBT model. Yes, some people have normal intrusions, but that's not what's going on for OCD. And so we don't have to just let it be and live our life turning our back away from intrusive thoughts, that we can dismantle the inference process that had us buying into it, that selected it for the thing, like why this obsession and not some other obsession. And that's where it becomes more workable. Again, very cognitive.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. That makes sense. Is there any part of I-CBT, or sorry, does exposure or the prevention of compulsions play any part in I-CBT?
I would say no to exposures. And when I say like, no, it's not required, right? There's no instruction to do exposures in the least in I-CBT. Response prevention, I think, can be considered sort of a natural byproduct of the work, but it's not front loaded, meaning it's not showing up day one. And it's not encouraged to be done effortfully. We're not like, you have to stop the compulsions. You have to reduce the compulsions. You have to play with the compulsions. One of the reasons for this, and we can talk about, how we're defining exposures, and so we can circle back if you'd like. But one of the reasons for this is that, right, like ERP, CBT, ACT, they're utilizing a conceptualization of OCD as that it's an anxiety disorder, that the primary problem is your anxiety and your relationship to it, or a phobic disorder model, right? Meaning that you're having a disproportionate response to a thing you shouldn't, right? You're doing compulsions when you shouldn't. There's no need. And so they treat that process, right? And it's good. It works. It's effective. I-CBT doesn't see OCD as an anxiety disorder primarily. It doesn't see it as a phobic disorder. Those things exist, but those things are all downstream of the doubting. And the doubting, again, is the verb. It is an active reasoning process that for OCD happens to be faulty or dysfunctional, and everything starts here. So OCD from an I-CBT standpoint says, no, we really do think this is the doubting disorder. We're not just playing lip service to that, right? We're not just saying it's the doubt disorder because you feel doubt. You're doubting, that's where it all starts. And everything follows from that, from the uncertainty to the anxiety, to the compulsion, to the avoidance. If the doubting never happened, what would be left?
Nothing.
If the doubting was never trusted, what would be left? If the guy driving down the street who hit the pothole said, man, I hope I didn't bend my rim, would he be driving the car around looking for dead bodies? No, That's conceptually what the difference is between the two. And the way we get there is not through exposures in the traditional sense, no prolonged in vivo or imaginal exposures, and primarily cognitive interventions, right? Now, we brought up reality sensing. One might make the argument that there's a behavioral component there, and I wouldn't disagree, but I would say that the model is so much bigger than that one module, and that we can't reduce the efficaciousness of this treatment to the one module of reality sensing out of all 12.
Yeah. Yeah, because of course that could be the pushback, right? That if there is any element of resisting compulsions, well, how do we not know that that's why it's helping? You know?
Yeah, and that has been the pushback. And I mean, I think it's fair. We can argue mechanisms. That's fine. Mm-hmm. Right. But the lived experience of people who go through this, what the research data is telling us, we can't dismiss it and we can't ignore it, that people are not doing ERP in I-CBT. That's just not what's occurring. Mm-hmm. And we don't want to misrepresent models. We don't want to dilute ERP to, just live using your senses normally. That's ERP. No, it's not. ERP is a conceptual framework that involves 50 years of research, right? Or more, right? And that involves the habituation model. And here comes the inhibitory learning model, which I don't know that there's any OCD trials with the inhibitory learning model yet.
I'm not sure.
On OCD, but I'm sure there will be. And we don't want to dismiss their research. We don't want to minimize their research and go, oh, it's all they're doing is X. And for the other models to say all I-CBT is doing is Y, mm-hmm. It just means that we haven't really fully understood the model. And that's, again, one of the reasons I'm here, to provoke interest, to clarify questions about this approach.
Yeah, interesting. So this, I think I'm going to ask this question in two parts. I think it's the same question. I think one's more personal to you and one's more generic, which is, can I-CBT be integrated in any way with ERP or ACT or anything like that? And do you still use ERP or even ACT? And then, because I guess in my head, if I think about all the different therapies I've covered, right, pretty much any therapy I've covered on this podcast can be integrated with ERP, ACT, FAP, CFT, IFS, psychoanalysis, if you want, to within reason. And I'm blanking on other stuff, but you name it, it could probably be integrated, right? So yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a natural question because, people, I think most therapists are integration focused in general, right? The issue here would be sort of fidelity to the mechanism of change that's being proposed by the model. All the models you mentioned, well, not all of them, but ACT, CBT, ERP, FAP, all of those models will look at OCD the same way, right? That it's an anxiety disorder, phobic disorder model, that the primary thing we need to disrupt is the compulsion, which is driving and maintaining the issue. Because again, they don't look at the obsessional formation the same way that I-CBT does. But yes, I do think you can integrate them. It would be sequentially, meaning we would do I-CBT first. And if there's leftover stuck points that we need to do exposure with, maybe there's an anxiety sensitivity we need to do interoceptive exposures with. Maybe I-CBT didn't fully resolve the issue, so we can maybe move to ERP. You could even possibly do it simultaneously, pursuing both the reduction of inferential confusion through I-CBT and going through ERP processes. But this would require you to be incredibly well studied and practiced on both models. So when we're learning it, we don't want to present the learning from an integration perspective first.
Yeah.
Right. Because that would be a dilution or it took me over a year to fully understand what was going on. Mm-hmm. And if I represent the average person who I wouldn't have benefited going to an IOCDF conference on how to integrate I-CBT and ERP if I didn't really understand the theoretical model of I-CBT first. But it certainly can be integrated. I think there's no reason why we can't say there are two well established mechanisms occurring, right? And that the anxiety disorder model, the phobic model really is happening with OCD, right? Compulsions do maintain obsessions, absolutely. And inferential confusion is demonstrated through dozens of peer-reviewed studies to be a core process that both creates and maintains obsessional doubting. So we could go after both. We just need to be cautious in doing it.
Yeah.
The other question you asked is sort of the one more personal to me is do I still practice these things? Yes, I still do ERP. I was never a manualized ERP person, right? I don't follow like, okay, it's session 7. I don't know anyone that really does unless maybe you're doing a research study. So if a client comes to me and says, listen, I had really good results with ERP like 2 or 3 years ago, and it comes back now, and great, let's do what worked for you in the past. I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I might introduce the sequence, which we get from I-CBT, because I think it's incredibly useful. And I might explain where these interventions would target the OCD processing. And then if they wanted to do ERP, we would do ERP. I like ACT, right? I do ACT for other disorders, right? So if we're talking about like looking at GAD, looking at depression, looking at social anxiety, I like ACT's framework here. I'm a big fan of ACT. I don't really do ACT for OCD as much. I do a lot of I-CBT. Part of that's deliberate because I'm really trying to get a lot of practice with a lot of different kinds of OCD, right? To see how I-CBT is working for those people. And so that's sort of somewhat of a long walk to answer your question. I still practice these things, but I've been doing more I-CBT quite deliberately because I really want to learn it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for your honesty. And how are you seeing it with your clients? How is it being received?
It's really well received with the majority of my clients. There's clients where I was stuck with ERP, right? Like we hit some kind of a wall. I'd like to think I do good ERP. I've been doing this for a long time. I've had really good training, really good mentorship. So I'm not doing sort of haphazard ERP where I took a PESI course over the weekend and called myself an ERP expert, right? Yeah. I've been immersed in this for a long time. So I know how to integrate motivational interviewing. I know how to integrate ACT. I know how to integrate mindfulness, compassion-focused therapy. Huge fan of Paul Gilbert and Russell Kultz and, Dennis Tersch. I really love the work they do. I can integrate all of that. And if the client still gets stuck, which happens, right? All of the good data, like the meta-analytic data of CBT for ERP, would say that people get clinically significant responses, 60-ish%, sort of rounding right there, 60-ish%. Okay. When we compare that to the outcome trials for I-CBT, it's the same. So no one model is going to work for 100% of people. So we do need to be flexible with that. But anyway, so I find it, and the clients have almost always have said, I've never looked at OCD this way before. It makes sense. This is the way my brain talks to me, right? Which I think is so important to help the client sort of feel understood and connected. This is how my brain talks to me. And now I know why. Now I know like where this is coming, why I'm susceptible to this obsession and not this obsession. So I found it to be quite helpful for my clients, but not 100% perfect.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for your honesty. And yeah, that's why I'm trained integratively. That's my passion. Like, yeah, but equally sometimes things need to be done as standalone too. So I'm just looking at my questions to make sure. Oh, so one final question I think from me on I-CBT is they sometimes talk about total resolution or cure. I don't know if they use the word cure, but total resolution that is implied from doing I-CBT. Just if you could explain that, because I know whenever ERP therapists or even ACT therapists have talked about, and ACT therapists don't, sorry, because ACT therapists are like, whether it's still there, that's okay. Are you living your life? That's kind of the gist of it, to boil it down again. But ERP is, if you talk about symptom reductions gone, you get crucified. So, and here I-CBT is kind of using those words.
Yeah, I struggled with those words too. I wasn't entirely sure what was trying to be communicated there. I think if I can sort of take a stab at that, would be that we can reduce the inferential confusion to such a degree that you no longer are absorbed into that narrative. And therefore, if you've spotted your tendency to have this kind of reasoning error around your vulnerable themes, which is something we haven't really talked about yet, but around your vulnerable themes, that conceptually you could see someone not getting tricked anymore, not falling into that nightmare anymore. So I think that what they're probably trying to get at is we can resolve inferential confusion. Do they think that you're never going to have a moment in the future where you get inferentially confused with new vulnerable stuff? Probably not.
Yeah.
I also think that a lot of this tension comes again from the conceptual differences, right? The normal intrusions that are not pathological, that happen to 80+% of people in the world. You're trying to say that somehow you make people not have intrusive thoughts. No, we're saying those intrusive thoughts are not what causes obsessional doubting, that it's a different process that we really have to understand and sink your teeth into to see the differences there. So there might be some of that playing out. There might be some linguistic differences, I think, again, developed in Montreal, a lot of work in the Netherlands. So I don't know exactly. I certainly wouldn't agree with the word cure. Personally, I don't know how but when we reduce inferential confusion, we see the Y box drop, which is the outcome measure for any good randomized controlled trial for OCD. And when you see the Y box drop below clinical levels, that means you're functionally not having symptoms that would be considered clinical. So that could be another way that this gets interpreted. Have we dropped people subclinical in the Y box by addressing and resolving inferential confusion? Yeah. So anyway, that's my stab at that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That does make it clearer. Maybe it could be reframed as subclinical resolution. That's the
perhaps. Yeah. And I don't know if Fred Ardema would take any issue with that or have any clarification with that. To help us understand that. I do think that the industry as a whole or our field as a whole looks at as OCD as something that isn't necessarily curable. And, I'm trying to remain neutral on whether something is or isn't curable because I don't know. Because, but a lot of that is driven by how you conceptualize the disorder. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, really good point. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. So I got a couple random questions at the end, as you know, but before that, is there anything else you wanted to say on I-CBT and OCD?
Sure. The last thing I'll say, we could talk for hours and hours on it, but that's not the purpose of today's podcast. But the one thing I think that I'd like to address just briefly is that if we're talking about inferential confusion, which is the dysfunctional reasoning process that's a central or core feature of how obsessions not only get created, but how they get maintained outside of compulsions. And inferential confusion is applied to two parts that reinforce this. The first part is here and now, present moment information. The guy drives the truck down the street, hits the pothole. Inferential confusion reasoning starts now. So happening in the here and now. But why now? Why with the pothole? Why on today? And this is where inferential confusion also is applied to the self. They call these vulnerable self themes or feared possible self. It is a conceptualization of the self that is opposite of who you actually are, your authentic or real self, right? Like I am a genuine person. I am a charitable person. I'm a nonviolent person. But what if I could be about to explode? What if I could be Mr. Hyde instead of Dr. Jekyll? And if I'm afraid I could be this person, and I'm also inferentially confused, I reason with the information about the self in the same way that I reason with that pothole, I might start to buy into and absorb into the story of who I could be, which creates a kind of surveillance process, like below the radar, that I'm kind of keeping an eye out for day to day. You don't necessarily know you're doing it. So if a person says, let's say they have the vulnerable self theme that I could be a negligent person, just generically, I could be a negligent person. And if they're driving down the street and they hit a bump and they had the thought, what if that was a person? That whole event right there was already something they were vulnerable to, because hitting something and being shocked by it can make you feel negligent, can sort of prime that issue. And if you're already predisposed to be inferentially confused about who you are, you're a negligent person maybe. Here's a circumstance in the here and now where I could be a negligent person. And so vulnerable self themes is what selects for particular kinds of OCD content and areas where, so when someone says, why this OCD topic and not another one? Vulnerable self themes help explain that. And all of this is not just some celery juice, woo woo left field stuff. There are dozens of peer reviewed studies that demonstrate vulnerable self themes as particularly relevant to OCD. And it's not just I-CBT research. There's been other research outside of I-CBT that looks at feared possible subs as relevant, as a better explainer for why these obsessions and not those obsessions. And same thing with inferential confusion as a whole. There's over 30 peer-reviewed studies that demonstrate inferential confusion as a primary process to the development of obsessional doubts. So none of this is sort of, left field or just philosophical musing, right? This has been tested, right? 9 different outcome trials, 3 of which are randomized controls, and there's 2 non-inferiority trials pitting ERP and I-CBT against each other, one in the Netherlands, one in Canada. They'll be coming out probably the next 18 months or so. And the preliminary data on one of those shows equivalence in outcome.
Yeah. So so with equivalence of outcome, almost exactly the same. Like
the effect sizes are in the upper range. So if we look at, like, again, in the non-inferiority trial, we don't have all of the data yet. So this is very preliminary. Anyone can actually go into icbt.online, and there's a presentation where Fred talks about the intricacies of that non-inferiority trial. Everyone can see it. In the other randomized controlled trials and open trials that they've used I-CBT with OCD, the effect sizes in those randomized controlled trials are in the upper range of the effect sizes of the meta-analyses done on ERP. So in 2015, there was a really good meta-analyses by Ost and colleagues that showed stuff. And another, Gail Steckity, did a mega analysis, which was sort of patient level. And then there was Gemma Reed's work in 2021. Right. And 2021? 2021, I think, maybe 22. I don't remember. And all of them sort of show similar effect sizes of ERP, which isn't like small. They're good effect sizes, but they're comparable to I-CBT's effect sizes, which again is why the non-inferiority trials were engaged. Like, hey, look, we're not showing a statistical difference in outcome, but statistical difference doesn't mean equivalent. That's a whole separate trial. And so that's why they created these trials, to show that these have non-inferiority or equivalence.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you. And the vulnerable self part was, and why that might lead on to particular themes was interesting to hear. Well, thank you for all of that. There's a lot for me to think about, and I will listen back. I have to edit, but I will enjoy listening back. 30-year-old self. I probably asked you about your 20-year-old self last time. So what would you tell your 30-year-old self? Words of advice.
Words of advice for my 30-year-old self. Trust yourself more. I'm an anxious person. I have been in the field since I was 25. And I don't think I opened my mouth publicly to talk about OCD or anxiety disorders until I was like 35. And it's all because of anxiety. And I felt like I didn't have anything useful to say. I think I would have liked to start earlier and get into this a little bit more. So trusting myself would probably be something I would tell my 30-year-old self. Also, be less dogmatic.
Yeah.
30-year-old Mike thought we have the answer to what causes or what sort of provokes OCD and how to treat it. Like we solved the puzzle, and anything outside of that can't be it. It can't be useful. And it started a bit of a turf war in my head. Anytime someone would come back and say, no, I can use this for OCD, and people got better. And I'm like, it can't be. Right. And now I can look back on that and be like, maybe be a little bit less closed to those ideas.
Well, yeah, important message. And until we get 100% effectiveness in a randomized control trial, we can't be closed-minded.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people suffer, and, we don't want to dismiss that number. Like, some people are fond of quoting sort of like the efficacy of ERP at like 75%. Like that's a single study. That's not meta-analytic data. So we can't sort of cherry pick one study. It's not really useful to do that. But even if meta-analyses showed 75 or 80% efficacy for people, that's still 20% of people. That's a lot of people, right? And the answer to those people isn't just do ERP better, or come back when you're ready, right? Like I would say, like, hey, if the amount of people suffering is between 20 and 40%, and that doesn't even include the people who don't pursue treatment at all, right? That's a lot of people. I mean, we really need to give those people a voice too, which is why I think having options that isn't just iterations of one model, right? Exposure and that's why I was so excited about I-CBT, despite the fact that I wrestled with it quite a bit when I was learning it.
Yeah, good point. So lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today about anything?
Probably, but I can't think of it. I'm sure if I go back and listen to it, I'll be like, oh, I really should have said this or done this better, or give you a different example of something. But I think, we'll leave it as is. Yeah, no, I think you did a really good job. And yeah, I'm sure it's probably not the last time I'll cover I-CBT. So this is a really good place to start. And thank you for coming on and sharing. Yeah, happy to be on. Thank you for having me and for your openness. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theOCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.